Call this meeting of the Wilson County Board of Education to order for April 20th, 2020. Members of the board, before we approve the agenda, we need to make a revision. If you will insert after Section 2, the Pledge of Allegiance moment of silence, if you would add revised regular board meeting schedule to become number 3, change your numbers accordingly, and at Roman numeral 7, make that Roman numeral 8, and please add GG. GG will be for the new Watt building, selection of building methods. Given that change, the chair will entertain a motion for the adoption of the revised agenda.
Madam Chair,
Mrs. Powell,
I move that we approve the revised agenda for April 20th, Wilson County Board of Education.
is there a second? It has been moved and properly seconded, moved by Mrs. Powell, seconded by Mrs. Barnes, that we approve the revised agenda. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, let it be known by the sign of aye. Aye. Am I going to be needing to make a roll call for votes?
I recommend you do that.
Yes. All right, on the recommendation of the board attorney, Mrs. Boyette, we need a verbal vote from you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, aye.
Okay, Mrs. Barnes,
Aye.
Mrs. Powell,
Aye.
Mr. Farmer, Mr. Farmer, are you with us?
Hold on, let me make sure.
Thank you very much. Mr. Breen,
Aye.
Mr. Mercer,
Aye.
and Fitch, aye. The motion carries unanimously. Mr. Farmer, you are leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance, to be followed by a moment of silence.
Yes. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members of the board, item 3 that we've just added calls for a revision of our regular board meeting schedule for the months of May and June. It is the request of the administration that we move the time of those 2 meetings to 4 o'clock, as we have done for today. What is your pleasure?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Mercer?
I move that we move the beginning time of the May school board meeting to 4 o'clock p.m.
Is that in for June as well as requested?
and June also.
All right.
Madam Chair, that would be for today's meeting, May's meeting, and June meeting.
That's what it used to be.
Well, okay. Well, I thought when we posted it and changed it that it was there. Okay, so Mr. Mercer, would you amend the motion to
I will amend
indicate
it.
today, May, and June meetings?
Yes, ma'am.
Is there a second?
Second.
It has been moved and properly seconded. The motion made by Mr. Mercer, seconded by Mr. Farmer, that we adjust our calendar and revise our regular board meeting schedule for not only today, but May and June to 4 o'clock p.m. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion. Mrs. Boyette?
Aye.
Mrs. Barnes,
Aye.
Mrs. Powell,
Aye.
Mr. Farmer,
Aye.
Mr. Breen,
Aye.
Mr. Mercer,
Aye.
and Fitch, aye. The motion carries unanimously. Next, we have the approval of the minutes. We have minutes of February 17th, 2020, our regular meeting, a March 9th, 2020 special board meeting, and April 6th, 2020 special board meeting. What is your pleasure?
Madam Chair,
Mrs. Barnes?
I move that we approve the minutes of February 17th, regular board meeting, March 9th, special meeting, and April 6th, special board meeting.
Second.
It has been moved by Mrs. Barnes, seconded by Mrs. Boyette, that we approve the minutes of February 17th, 2020, regular meeting, March 9th, 2020, special board meeting, and April 6th, 2020, special board meeting. Is there any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor of the motion, Mrs. Boyette,
Aye.
Mrs. Barnes,
Aye.
Mrs. Powell,
Aye.
Mr. Farmer,
Aye.
Mr. Breen,
Aye.
Mr. Mercer,
Aye.
and Fitch, aye. Let the record reflect that the motion carries unanimously. We're now down to the chairman's report. I just would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Mills, the the senior staff, the teachers, the custodians, the secretaries, food service, bus drivers, maintenance personnel, everybody in the Wilson County Schools family. And if I left anybody out, charge it to my head, not to my heart. But thank you so much for the work that you have done in this unprecedented time with the coronavirus situation, in making sure that our students remain safe, as well as the staff remain safe. You have done an outstanding job of continuing the efforts of the school system, and I just want to heartily congratulate you and thank you so much for all of the hard work that you have done. We hope that the spring break that we had just this past week allowed those who have been truly on the front lines the opportunity to get just a moment's rest and come back renewed and invigorated for the continuation of what is still unknown. As you know, the governor has closed schools through the 15th of May, which would mean a restart on May the 18th on Monday, but we don't know if he's going to continue that, so we have no knowledge as to whether or not we will even be returning to school for the remainder of the academic year. So please take note of the messages that go out in regard to what is going on with the school system, and we will work diligently to make sure that any changes of schedules or anything else are made known for the public. That concludes the the chairman's report. We're now to the superintendent's report.
Madam Chair, board members, and others, I've got a few things to share, some good news. I would like to also comment about spring break. You know, last week was our traditional school spring break, and it was certainly different than in the last years.
Excuse me, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Dr. Mills' audio is going in and out.
All right.
How about now?
Okay, good.
Better? Okay.
Yes.
All right. I just wanted to point out that with our spring break last week being so different for us, that I'm glad we did get to have that break. For many of our folks have been working a lot of extra time and extra energy to try and figure things out. Food service and maintenance, especially, and transportation, were really quick to get things turned around as we closed down. And so I know some of our students were disappointed about not being able to travel, but it is nice that folks were safe and at home. And we did have that break. I also wanted to thank SPOT and some other community organizations that helped out last week with meals for our families and students during that time period when we were closed down. And the early college staff and students, now, they were still at work last week, so they kept things going for us. I do have a few things I would like to celebrate. I know it's kind of hard right now to think about those kinds of things, but we do have some positive things going on. Our North Carolina pre-K program has recognized Jones Elementary School as earning a 5-star child care license. That's from the Department of Health and Human Services Division of Child Development and Early Education. That was effective in March. The program, if you remember, opened in September 2019, and we're really proud of the students and staff, and that's a wonderful thing. We're really ready to have them all back as soon as we can, but 5-star rating is not a simple task, and it's something to be proud of. So we're very excited about that for Jones and our pre-K program. Also, Distinguished Leadership Program. You've heard us talk about that for DLP through NC-PAPA, Principals and Assistant Principals Association. I wanted to recognize Lucama Principal Zach Marks for completing that. That's a year-long professional development program for principals. It's very rigorous and it's a very respected program. Again, most of the folks that go through it will tell you it's as challenging as their master's program. We're really proud of Mr. Marks for completing it, and we're really thankful to have him here as our principal. So that one went on, and that was right before things closed down, actually, when they had the graduation ceremony. I wanted to take a second to thank, again, our child nutrition folks and our transportation and maintenance departments as a special shout out for all they did for the food site work to get those schools set up and those places set up for us. We did a lot to make sure that those food sales and, food sites were possible after things closed so quickly. At one point, we had about 67 sites throughout the county. There was an article in Ed North Carolina magazine that did an interview with Mary Catherine Talton, our child nutrition director, who's been doing a fabulous job. And we're really thankful for all the work that those frontline people have done that's gone unnoticed, unfortunately, but it's just the things they do and the extra things they do because it really has set us apart and it's made a big difference for our students and our families. So if you get a chance to see those folks out and about, keep your social distance, but do tell them thank you. And I think it's been amazing. It's been amazing to watch them figure out things as we go along. I also want to thank our instructional services, technology department, and our principals and teachers for the work that they put in and all the brain power and quick thinking that was used to figure out how to manage some of the instructional issues we run into with being in a different environment, to go from traditional classroom learning to remote learning so quickly in just 2 weeks' time. I mean, that is a lot to do under any circumstances, but it's really difficult to do when you can't get together and plan. It's kind of hard to do that when we're used to getting in a room and figuring things out, and in these circumstances, you can't do that. So all the staff members who provide professional development for our teachers and staff, our technology facilitators did a fabulous job, and our teachers have really done an amazing job of making the switch and checking on our students and doing those wellness checks, but also being there for them with their instructional needs. And this week, we're rolling out new instructional materials and starting up that new process for us. So they'll be calling the homes of all our students this week and making those connections for us. And we're really excited about that. That's different. But again, our folks have been amazing. They've just been amazing to get as much done as we have during this time period and to really look out for their families and their students, as we knew they would and they always do, but it sure is nice to see that. It is National Assistant Principals Week. Kind of hard to recognize assistant principals for the work they do when we're not in school, but we do know that they make a big difference every day, and that's April 6th through the 10th. That was last week when we were out, but we really appreciate all they do to support not only their principals in their schools, but our district and their students, and they've been very busy through this process as well. And finally, I just wanted to do the same thing that Dr. Fitch was saying, which is to thank a lot of the people. And, you can't thank everyone because you'll leave somebody out, but certainly from our finance department, human resources, our classified staff, exceptional children, custodians, counselors, teacher assistants. There are so many folks that are going above and beyond what they're asked to do every day. And we've been very fortunate to have such great people in our family to do that for our kids. We've also had a lot of support from the county and the city, and those folks are amazing. It is really nice to be able to pick up the phone and ask questions and get support, and vice versa. From Green Light, law enforcement, sheriff's department, city police, city and county and emergency management, everyone has been so overwhelmingly supportive and helpful with some of the issues we've had to go and figure out. It's just really a testament to how great a place we are in and how lucky we are to be a part of it, even though this is a really, really scary issue we're dealing with and a really tough time. It's a tough time for a lot of people that we may never know what folks are dealing with, but it sure is nice that we can look out for each other. And no one really cares who gets credit, everybody wants to do the work. So, and Madam Chair, that's my report.
Thank you so very much. There is no one who has signed up to address the board. So we'll move to item 8, the discussion and information items. We have under information, Administrative Regulation 3461, for regulation honorary high school diploma.
Let me get that. One more. How's that?
Madam Chair, you may remember that, I don't remember how many meetings ago it was now, but we had a policy for the honorary high school diploma that was passed by the board. And so today, we would like to share with you the administrative reg that we will follow.
All right. Members of the board, you had that as part of your packet. Do you have any questions or concerns or issues that you wanted to ask about this? Now, this is a regulation, but this still is a first read, or it
Just for information?
just for information, correct? Okay. You found that in red and then in the black copy. Any questions, comments, issues, concerns? Hearing none, then let's move on to Administrative Regulation 3320, school trips.
We are presenting this regulation as well for information only. We have a new revised school trip, title changed from field trip to school trip. And you will also see attached not only the regulation, but also the forms that we have to go along with the school trips. You may notice that in this particular regulation, we have also the form about the private use for the vehicle. So that's the second form that's in there as well.
Yes. Any questions, issues, comments, concerns, discussion?
I had just one, Madam Chair.
Mrs. Barnes?
When I looked at line 125,
All right.
copies of signed and completed parental consent forms as described below, and it just seems like it's misplaced. Is that including items or letters C through D, or just how much below is it referencing?
That's a very good question. The below would be the form that's attached at the end, so it would go after the way that it'll show up on the in our policy section. You'll see all of the written words, and then at the bottom of the regulation will be those two forms, and that's where the word below. So you'll scroll down several pages and it'll be below. But I certainly understand what you're saying. That makes it sound like it would be in the very next section for C.
Yes.
Would it be cleaner and clearer if you made those forms to be an appendix? And then you could label them Appendix A and Appendix B?
Yeah, we can do that.
That is the proclamation.
That would be helpful.
That's easy to do. That's good. That's
We
good.
can change the wording of that to make it clear.
So that instead of C, Section 5 below, you would reference Appendix A, which could be the first form, which was the parent and guardian school trip itinerary and consent form, and Appendix B, the private vehicle use form?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Does that address your issue, Mrs. Barnes?
It does, that works.
Okay. Any other Mrs.
Madam-
Boyette?
I'd just like to commend Dr. Wilson and those that were involved. This does look like a comprehensive administrative regulation. I'm sure there may be something that was left out that will have to be addressed, but this does appear to be very comprehensive.
All right.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions, issues, concerns, discussion? Hearing none, then we'll move to, thank you so much. We'll move to draft policy 6125, administering medicines to students. This is a first read.
Yes, ma'am. We're bringing this policy, particularly today, out of order that we would typically go to the policy meeting that would be in May. However, the reason that we're bringing it is because we were trying to get the first read today, and then if any kind of changes that need to be made in sometime in the May meeting, whether it's at the next policy meeting or at the regular board meeting in May, because this would definitely be a policy that would also need to be in a student handbook, just like the other two regulations, or the two regulations that we shared with you today. And if this particular policy is approved, then it will repeal two policies that we currently have, 3260 and 4210.
All right. Members of the board, do you have any questions, comments, issues, concerns, or discussion in regard to policy 6125, administering medicines to students? Then this will come back to us at our next meeting, and we will move on to Administrative Regulation 6125, administering medicines to students, which is complementary to the first the policy we just looked at for first read.
Yes, so this is for information, and I failed to say with the last, we did have our nurses read both the policy and the administrative reg. We took what we have in Wilson County Schools, our practice, as well as the recommendations from the School Board Association to develop this regulation.
All right?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Under Roman numeral 2 in line 6970, I was very happy to see this. I'm sure that they've listened to input from nurses, principals, teachers, whereas a short-term prescription medication now, such as an antibiotic that they were giving, you can give that with the parent's written permission now without requiring another one from the doctor, because I know that was always an issue in the school when we had to have both permission forms. By the time you got it from the doctor, other than the prescription, the 10 days the child was taking it was over with. So that was good.
Okay. Thank you. Other comments? All right, that was informational. And item E, contracts for board notification.
Board members, we have a couple contracts that just need to share with you. NC Sound is installing a new camera system at Forest Hills Middle. Contracts pending legal review. That's for just under $60,000. That's money coming from the Safe Schools grants. We have some monies earmarked for that as part of the school safety grants. And one of the reasons we chose Forest Hills to go back in was the WASH clinic being a part of that campus. And so we have folks coming in and out of campuses from other areas with that. So we thought that would be a good place to start that installation of the newer camera systems. Those are similar in effect and functioning as those at the high school, the high definition camera system.
Do we have that same issue and concern at Beddingfield with WASH being at that location?
They've got some cameras there, but those are the newer cameras. These are the newer camera systems is what we're trying to do.
And as we have had discussion about a dental clinic, and that's going to be mobile, and things will go in and out of the classroom, will it be necessary to have cameras for that, or will the equipment come back onto the vehicle from the health department?
It'll come back onto the vehicle, and we just have to designate a classroom space.
Okay.
And so that's something we have control over and could put it in a central location that's very visible, and we could keep an eye on.
Okay.
Yeah. That was some of our thinking about the location for that, or the school assignment rather, from NC Sound. The other one is the information, and Mr. McPherson can give us some more information about this, but Skinner, Farlow, and Kerwin Architecture will be providing the bidding and contract administration services for the re-roofing project at Hearn. Remember, we went through that in a previous meeting, and that cost has come back, and it is very favorable to us. It will not exceed $15,000. So that's a great savings for us. And that contract has been reviewed by the attorneys. So both these pieces are for information for you.
And because that's under our
It's
threshold,
under
we
your threshold.
don't have to,
That's
okay.
correct.
Okay.
Yes.
That's correct, Madam Chair.
And the NC Sound amount was what again?
$59,532.24.
All right?
Madam Chair,
Yes, Ms. Boyette.
what were the Hearn roof replacement, the money we're saving, what were we paying for that? Was that capital or was that something else?
That was capital funds.
Okay, so.
Yes, ma'am. We could use that on other projects.
Okay, gotcha.
Yes, ma'am.
Any other questions or comments? All right, so now we can move to the action items in this area. Most of these are second read policies that we did at the last policy review in March. If there were no major changes, can we at least do a motion that covers A through double A as one read?
Yes, Madam Chair.
All right. Members of the board, we are advised by our counsel that rather than going one by one by one by one, since we've already done that, that we can, if it is your pleasure, we can handle policies A through double A in one motion. And if in your motion, if that is your pleasure, you indicate the removal of any stated motions as required by this revision.
Madam Chair,
Madam,
Mr. Mercer?
I move that we approve the policies listed in today's agenda A through AA, and also move that we remove any policies that these replace.
And this is as a second read, so is there a second to the motion?
Second.
Who made this?
Second.
Ms. Boyette?
Ms. Boyette, thank you. It has been moved by Mr. Mercer, seconded by Mrs. Boyette, that we approve policies A through AA on today's agenda, and at the same time, remove any necessary policies that these revisions replace. Is there any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor of the motion, let it be known by the sign of... Oh, that's right, thank you.
That's okay.
We'll do the roll call. Mrs. Boyette?
Aye.
Mrs. Barnes?
Aye.
Mrs. Powell? Mrs. Powell?
Sorry. Aye.
Thank you. Mr. Farmer?
Aye.
Mr. Breen?
Aye.
Mr. Mercer? And Fitch? Aye. The motion carries unanimously. Thank you so much. So that we are now down to item BB, revised academically and intellectually gifted AIG plans. Dr. Wilson?
Yes, ma'am. Jennifer Lewis is here to share. She's the one who's worked primarily on the AIG plan.
Now, this is something that we have to approve on a yearly basis for the Department of Public Instruction. Is that correct?
It's actually every 3 years.
Every 3 years, okay.
We just have voted on, well, I say you all just voted on it last spring. And when we got some feedback from DPI, they gave us some good feedback. And I said, do I just need to share this with y'all for information that I updated it? And they said we actually would want a vote since I had to add something to the last page 32, the whole Article 9B. Apparently, when it got cut and pasted, this area was left out and it needed to be in there. And that's why it was requiring another vote. And while I was adding that in, there's a couple other items in red that I just updated to make it more clear. But on page 32 and 33 is the big addition that needed your approval in there. And it's basically about how parents can dispute or share grievances if they have an issue with AIG. And we needed to have the North Carolina law in there as well as a statement about our grievance policy for Wilson County.
Okay, there was at least one other red insertion that was made, and that was on page 12. And
Yeah.
I'm sorry, let's go back to page 4, because there were other, starting at page 4, you had a couple of points that were made that you can find in red, members of the board. And then we look at page 12, and you will find other changes that were made in red for your, just to make sure that you had seen these. And then as stated on page 32 and 33 of the document.
And on page 3 and 4, it was just a recommendation that I make it very clear and step out how K2 and 3 through 12 would be. And so that's exactly what I did. I thought if it was a recommendation, I would go ahead with that because it did make it more clear. And on page 12, the percentage in the middle of page 12, you'll see is 90%. And that used to be 95%, and since it's been changed recently, I went ahead and updated it now instead of waiting a couple of years.
Okay. And thank you for, because I had missed page 3, but thank you for pointing that out. Did I hear someone starting to make a comment?
Yes, which page did she say that they changed it to 90%?
On page 12,
Page 12.
yes.
It's credit for demonstrated mastery, and we don't have any students at all that fall into that category. But they used to have to score a 95%, and now they just need to score a 90 to receive credit.
And one more question, page 4, when you spelled out the K-2 identification and placement, the school system, do we pay for the aptitude and achievement score? Who pays for that testing, or is it part of our normal testing?
It's, the AIG budget is what pays for our testing.
Other questions? Given those changes, what is your pleasure in regard to the revised AIG plan?
Madam Chair,
Mrs. Barnes?
I move that we approve the revised academically intellectually gifted plan with the changes.
Second.
Was that Mrs. Powell?
Yes.
It has been moved by Mrs. Barnes and seconded by Mrs. Powell that we approve the revised academically and intellectually gifted, or AIG, plan. Is there any other comment or question? Hearing none. Mrs. Boyette, what is your pleasure?
Aye.
Mrs. Barnes?
Aye.
Mrs. Powell?
Aye.
Mr. Farmer?
Aye.
Mr. Breen?
Aye.
Mr. Mercer? Fitch? Aye. Let the record reflect that the motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, Madam Chair, I do have one question.
Yes.
I was interested in the numbers of students that we have in the AIG program. Has it increased?
We have been trying to increase, and we were in the middle of testing this spring when this COVID-19 out of school closures began. So we are hoping by our fall head count, the numbers will increase because we'll be able to finish our spring testing. More students. And we did pick up several third graders this fall when we tested all the third graders. So we currently had about 5.6%, and then after our fall testing, we had moved up to 5.8%, so we are trying to increase our numbers.
All right.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Hearing none, let's move on to item CC, student fees for 2021 school year.
Mr. Linden has some information on that.
All right.
Good evening. This evening, we bring you a schedule of proposed fees that we are proposing to be charged to students for various services and goods during the 2020-2021 school year. Per board policy 4600 student fees, we're asking that you grant approval of these fees for use for next year. Our school administrators have worked together in an attempt to maintain some consistency from school to school in the fee amounts. Once we have an approved fee schedule, it'll be submitted to the superintendent of public instruction in Raleigh.
All right.
I had one question.
Go ahead, Mrs. Barnes.
And I think that Mr. Linden may have clarified it the last time, but I've forgotten why the amount discrepancy in Hunt High School's cost for you as the others don't seem to be as much, or they're not as much.
The cost of the yearbooks is the one variable that is really hard to nail down, other than it is the number of pages in the yearbook, the number of color portraits in the yearbook, whether or not it's hardbound or softbound. So it's really the work of the yearbook advisor and how they're putting that yearbook together that's going to be a huge component on the final cost of that product.
So is this figure based upon the previous year's cost?
Yes, ma'am. There were actually no increases proposed for next year over what is being currently charged.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Farmer?
Mr. Lennon, the 4 schools that do yearbooks, do they use the same company, or each one of them using a different company?
They use different companies, and not to name drop, but I know Jostens is used, and I know that Strawbridge is used. I'm not sure of any other ones, but I know those 2 are used.
Well, I'm wondering if they use the same company, if we would get a much clearer price and a very smaller range than one school costing twice as much as another school, even though they are somewhat larger.
Well, and again, it's not necessarily the cost of what the vendor is charging the schools. It's the product that the school is choosing to purchase as their yearbook. For instance, Bedingfield, with a smaller school population, is going to have fewer pages in their yearbook, so it's going to cost less to produce that than, for instance, Pike or Hunt with larger populations.
I'm just thinking that if one company did all of them, maybe we could get a better price because we are buying in bulk.
That's a valid point, and we will definitely look into that.
But
I have another question, sorry. on that,
Mrs.
Chair.
Barnes?
Is it the choice of the schools that don't have a yearbook to not have one? I just noticed about 4 that don't have one. Is it the school choice?
Yes, ma'am, that is correct. The schools choose not to have one.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Mercer?
Also, I think there may be some advantage in looking into one vendor serving all 3 schools, but they have a setup fee for the pages, and then that's part of that fee is determined by the number of pages that they run on what they set up. So it may make a difference, or it might not, because I'm not an expert being me.
So what is your pleasure? This is an action item. And if the schools explore a single vendor, then if the prices that are within the bounds here, certainly we would think that the cost would be much lower, and that we would not have to revisit this. We would just have to, the individual schools would make their adjustments. But what we're basically would be saying is that these are the maximum numbers that the schools can charge. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, ma'am, I believe that to be accurate.
That's what it's saying.
Okay. Mr. Farmer?
I was just so concerned about the kids. Many of their parents don't have jobs, don't have any way to put food on the table. And some of these prices are really, really tough. And I'm hoping maybe that we could reduce these prices this year if no other time.
That, Mr. Farmer, I think that the point being made was that they will explore a single vendor to see if there is a better price point that can be achieved, and that
Thank you.
the prices listed here at most would be the most that a school would charge, but hopefully we can see a decrease in the price.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other comments, questions?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Mercer?
I think it would be interesting to see the benefits we could learn from combining their efforts, so to speak. But I think as a recommendation, someone might need to mediate that, because each school is going to prefer to have their person they've been dealing with because of the convenience and understanding. So if the meeting of the minds could come together with somebody to mediate that, certainly not as a requirement, but I think it'd be a good suggestion.
Madam Chair, one thing you could consider doing is issuing an RFP for these services, if that's something that the board is interested in. You may not want to legislate that, though. But if it's just something that the board's interested in looking at, it doesn't, but you could always, I've got districts who do that. They issue an RFP for yearbook providers in order to try to maximize funding, but at the same time.
And minimize costs.
And minimize costs, yes, ma'am.
And Madam Chair, I was going to add too, I've also got down to share with the principals about who handles their graduation arrangements, with robes.
Yes.
And boards and all as well too. That was something, if we could standardize that, that would also be some things we could include in that conversation. That's been on my list for about 6 months, but right now, with the current state of things, I'm going to leave everything alone with graduations for this year. But that's a conversation piece we're going to have.
If we act on this today, because if I'm not mistaken, do the schools put their cost within their student handbooks? And there could, and it could always have an asterisk.
Yep.
That the price is being negotiated, which
determined.
could result in a lower cost, so that even though we are looking at the prices that are listed here, that these may not be the final prices. Is that fair to assume, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And that some type of mediation of cost would be dealt with?
Yes, ma'am, we can definitely do that.
So, Madam Chair,
Mr. Mercer?
so are we looking at this to begin with our efforts to minimize the cost to students and so forth for the 2021 school year?
I think we are looking to minimize the cost.
Because, we may be in the midst of it. Certainly at this point, I would imagine there's a lot of plans already in place, so.
Would it be prudent at this point to table this particular item and bring it back at the May meeting?
I think if we could make the suggestions you made about putting notes in there depending on what we find out about, prices are subject to change, but this would be the maximum.
Okay.
If we know that's the maximum right now and there's nowhere for it to go but down or level out, at least for the one that stands out among the outlier, that might be easier to do given what we're going to be dealing with.
Okay.
Would that work?
Will that work, members of the board?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
All right, so this is an action item, so we still need a motion in regard to this particular item, and we'll craft a wording so that the points that have been made will be addressed. Is that fair?
Madam Chair,
Mrs. Boyette?
I move that we approve the student fees for 2020-2021 school year as recommended.
Is there a-
second.
It has been moved by Mrs. Boyette, seconded by Mrs. Barnes, that we approve the student fees for 2020-2021 school year as recommended. For the maker of the motion, are you inclusive of any cost mitigation points that were made?
Yes, with recommendation that we explore, as noted, that these would be maximum cost.
Okay. For the second of the motion, are you in agreement?
Yes.
Thank you. It has been moved and properly seconded then. We shall take a vote. Mrs. Boyette?
Aye.
Mrs. Barnes?
Aye.
Mrs. Powell?
Aye.
Mr. Farmer?
Aye.
Mr. Breen?
Can I hear the full motion again, please?
I knew you'd do that. It has been moved and properly seconded that we approve the recommended student fees for 2020-2021 school year with mitigation cost to be explored so that these fees listed would be the max as they work toward a lower cost.
No.
Mr. Mercer?
Aye.
And Fitch, aye. The record reflects that the motion carries 6-1. Next is item DD, sale of broadcast trailer.
Board members, previously we discussed the broadcast trailer and brought that to the board, and there was some questions from the board to go back and get some legal guidance on. Again, this is the trailer that's been used historically to handle graduations and broadcasting events and recording of board meetings, but now with some of our setups, we do not need that. It's not being used on a regular basis. If you remember, that's the background pieces of it. So we tabled the sale of the trailer back to the city of Wilson until the lawyers can pull some information together and make some changes. So Mr. McPherson is here, and they've made those changes to the bill of sale and then the MOU. So we're just asking this be approved so we can move ahead with that simple sale and transfer.
All right. Members of the board, what is your pleasure?
I have a question, Madam Chair.
Mrs. Barnes?
Given that the date of the bill of sales was previously a March 2020 date, will you be changing it to the April 2020?
Yes, ma'am.
Or what date will you use?
We would need to change that to the date that the board approves it, and we can do it after that.
Are there any other questions?
Thank you, Ms. Barnes.
You're welcome.
The chair will entertain a motion.
Madam Chair,
Mrs. Powell?
I move that we would like the administration to receive the sale of the broadcast trailer.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
It has been moved and properly seconded that the administration move forward with the sale of the broadcast trailer. Is there any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor of the motion, let it be known by the sign of aye. I'm sorry. Boyette?
Aye.
Barnes?
Aye.
Powell?
Aye.
Farmer?
Aye.
Breen?
Aye.
Mercer?
Aye.
Fitch? Aye. Let the record reflect that the motion carries unanimously. Item FF, 2020-2021 local current expense and capital outlay budgets.
Okay. Board members, Ms. Evans and Ms. James are here remotely as well. And Ms. Evans can go through the budget amendments with you.
Okay, are we doing the budget amendments or are we going to do
Budget amendments.
Budget amendments or the budget?
Budget amendments first.
Okay, amendment number 103 to the state public school fund reflected changes made due to the allotment revision forms that were received from DPI. Amendment 202 to the current expense fund represented changes made due to budget alignments and the budgeting of miscellaneous fines and forfeitures. Amendment 303 to the federal fund reflected the budgeting and alignment of various federal programs. And Amendment 803 to the local special revenue fund reflected the budgeting of various grants and programs. Are there any questions concerning any of the amendments?
Members of the board, we have, the floor is open for a motion to approve the budget amendments 103, 202, 303, and 803 as presented by the Finance Officer.
Madam Chair,
Mrs. Boyette,
I move that we approve budget amendments 103, 202, 303, and 803 as presented.
is there a second?
Second.
It has been moved by Mrs. Boyette, seconded by Mr. Farmer, that we approve budget amendments 103, 202, 303, and 803. Is there any discussion?
The second was Mr. Breen, wasn't it?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I beg your pardon. My error, Mr. Breen. The motion was made by Mrs. Boyette and seconded by Mr. Breen.
Breen, you owe me $1.
I think you owe me $1. Making you sound that good.
For budget items 103, for amendment items 103, 202, 303, and 803. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none. What is your pleasure, Mrs. Boyette?
Aye.
Mrs. Barnes?
Aye.
Mrs. Powell?
Aye.
Mr. Farmer?
Aye.
Mr. Breen?
Aye.
Mr. Mercer?
Aye.
Fitch? Aye. Let the record reflect that the motion carries unanimously. So that leaves us with the 2021 current expense and capital outlay budgets.
Yes, Madam Chair, again, Ms. Evans and Ms. James are online with us for the budget discussion. What you've got in front of you is the 2021 local current expense and capital outlay budgets. Based on where we are right now with the situation of the shutdown and closure and some of the changes we've seen coming, we know this is a working document, as most are at this point. But I will point out just a few things. It's almost identical to last year in terms of the proportions and balances. The few things we have done, and Ms. Evans did, was work in and anticipated there's an increase of teacher salaries of 4% and classify for 2%. There's also, you'll see changes due to charter school enrollment adjustment. Also another area was adjustment for maintenance to provide them some additional funds that we've been allocating during the year anyway. So we just went ahead and made the allotment this year early on because of some of the things we've had to address. And those are the biggest changes for the current expense.
All right. Members of the board? Now, this goes over to county commissioners by the end of the month.
End of the month.
And our presentation to them is scheduled for what date, unless their schedules are changing due to this corona?
I don't anticipate their schedules to change. Let me look up my date. I think it's May.
May 5th.
May 5th, thank you.
May 5th. Let's see, that's a Tuesday.
Members of the board, what is your pleasure?
The one piece of the budget that we did not discuss that is part of that, if there's no discussion on the current expense, is the capital outlay piece, Madam Chair.
Yes.
And in your packets, board members, and Mr. Letchworth is here in the audience. The capital projects that we have down for 2021, again, these are always in flux, but these are what we were recommending. And I'll go through that list with you very quickly for everyone's benefit. Would be replacing a chiller at Lee Woodard. That's a cost of $110,000. Rock Ridge to replace the sewer pumps. That's $176,000. That is a, and Mr. Letchworth, you correct me, that's a long run from where they are from that campus, and those are needed. We're also, again, adding 2 new activity buses to try and rebuild our fleet a little bit at a time. We've been doing that each year since I've been here. It is time for us to purchase a new backhoe. The one we have is on its last leg. In fact, they don't even make equipment for it anymore. Mr. Letchworth welded the wheel together the last time we were using it when it split. You can't even get parts for it for that. So I think we've gotten our good out of that one. It is something we need. And then the last 3 items are at Fike, Gardner's, and Barnes is to upgrade the HVAC controls, and that will be something that will be a benefit to us down the line and allow some remote management as well. So that would quickly use up the $1 million. And again, that is separate from the conversations we've had with the county manager about some additional projects as well as the WAP program. So they've been very gracious to us.
All right.
So if there's no questions on those projects, then that was kind of what we were thinking about doing with the monies for the coming year.
Okay.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Mercer?
I have a question about the Rock Ridge replacement sewer pump. That will not interfere with the agreement or with the, is that not tied into the fire department, maybe rescue squad?
Working with just that.
But I mean, that doesn't impact that, does it?
No.
Great.
We don't want to lose those pumps for school safety.
I mean, this is something that's necessary anyway,
Yes.
and it's not brought on by the fire department rescue squad?
No.
And it doesn't impair us or
No.
impact them negatively?
No. No. That field is way on down the road from the school. So this would be a good thing. It would not affect them.
I just recall that we have an agreement.
Yeah, we do.
And I was hoping that wouldn't interfere or impede the project at all.
No, sir. You're right.
Any other questions? What is your pleasure in regard to the 2020-2021 local current expense budget and capital outlay budget?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Mercer?
I move that we approve the 2020-2021 local current expense and capital outlay budgets as recommended by administration.
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Mercer, seconded by Mrs. Boyette, that we approve the 2020-2021 local current expense and capital outlay budgets as presented by the administration. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, Mrs. Boyette?
Aye.
Mrs. Barnes?
Aye.
Mrs. Powell?
Aye.
Mr. Farmer?
Aye.
Mr. Breen?
Aye.
Mr. Mercer?
Aye.
Fitch? Aye. Let the record reflect that the motion carries unanimously. Item GG, the new Watt building, selection of building methods. Dr. Mills?
Yes, sir. Madam Chair, I'm pulling up a document so I can share with everyone that Mr. McPherson wanted to go through with the board. And give me 1 second, we'll pull that up. Then I'm going to share my screen.
All right.
Dr. Mills, if you'll take it to slide 10 whenever you get to them.
Okay. Let me get back out. Hold on 1 second. Let me do it this way. 10 or 9?
10.
Okay.
Well, we can start.
Trying to help you out.
Yeah.
All right, so let me go back to. Hold on. There we go.
All right. Good afternoon, board.
Good afternoon.
The task that is before you is the selection of a building method for the new Watt building. But before we start talking about how you guys want to go about building the new Watt building, I figure you should know all your options, what options are available to you. So I've got 4 slides I'm going to share with you as part of a presentation I do for boards about school construction. The email I sent you earlier this afternoon, I advise you save it. It's a nice, quick, easy reference to use and pull out whenever you're building to talk about where we are along the process. With number 9, that slide, we're talking about the construction contracting. So you guys just finished picking your architect for the new Watt building. That is Skinner, Farlow, and Kerwin. They are very excited about this project, but the next step of the process is figuring out how you want to go about the actual building of the process. So first slide outlines the cost of a new school that is greater than $500,000, which this will be, as you can all probably imagine. It's going to be $20 million or less, which I think everybody has agreed we'd hope for less, but at the same time, $20 million is a significant sum of money, and we're thankful to have the opportunity to work with that sum. But you have to go through formal bidding requirements because you are expending public dollars to build a facility over $500,000. That's just the law in the state of North Carolina. It mirrors the federal law in lots of ways. The $500,000 is a solid threshold. That includes advertising, sealed bids. Bids must be in a paper form. There's a bid deposit that has to be placed down. There's a public bid opening, generally speaking, and there's a 3-bid minimum. The general standard for a formal bidding process is the lowest responsive responsible bidder standard of award. It's what government entities like yourself do all the time. Whenever you put something out for an RFP, you don't get to just pick someone because you like them. You get to pick them because they're giving you the lowest price that is responsive to what you asked for and is responsible in their delivery method, if you will. The next elements are historically underutilized business requirements, which is done through the state hub office, which is you have to utilize minority and owned businesses. There's a percentage that this board has decided that they want to achieve, which is a state standard. The idea being that you want to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to get governmental contracts. Dispute resolution procedures, which you've adopted, there are specific specifications for your 4 major categories, HVAC, plumbing, electrical in general, and there's specific bid and building delivery methods, which is what we're going to talk about. So here on page 10, or on slide 10, are the options. The first is single prime. Multi-prime is the second, and dual bidding is the third. Now, I've divided these up into the traditional methods versus the alternative methods because the traditional methods have been in existence for a very long time versus the alternative methods, which the oldest of these is the construction manager at risk. But that piece of it, we'll talk about the specifics of each one of these methods in a second, but that's how I divide them up. It is what pre-existed about 1970 and what came into existence around 1970. Some of these are even younger than that. The public-private partnerships were allowed in North Carolina as early as the 2007, approximately. I could be off on that, but it's a relatively young procedure. It's the idea of allowing a private entity to build a public building and then the public entity lease it, but we'll get into that in a second. The next slide is the traditional methods. With single prime, which is arguably one of the most common ways to go about building anything, the board would solicit bids via a request for proposals or an RFP for a single prime contractor to perform all the work of building the building, select the lowest responsible bidder from that selection to perform that work. That single prime contractor would solicit and contract with subcontractors for HVAC, plumbing, electrical, etc. So that it means that only one entity would have a contract with the Board of Education, and that would be the general contractor, if you will. So he would go about the business of getting his subs lined up and giving you prices based on the drawings prepared by the architect, and they would put in their estimate for what it would cost to build the building designed by the architect. And then whoever is the lowest responsible bidder is the winner. It's pretty straightforward. I will happy to take questions as we go along, but does the board have any questions about what single prime is? Okay, multi-prime. This was something that came into vogue, was in existence for a long period of time, but came into vogue in the 80s and 90s, which is the governmental entity, in this case, the Board of Education, would solicit bids via an RFP for the 4 categories of a building, your HVAC, your plumbing, electrical, and general, and contract individually with each one of those contractors. So instead of having one contract, you would have 4 contracts. And you'd have to manage the relationship between those 4 contractors working together. And nobody is really the head dog except for the school district because you have an individual contract with each one. I will say from an administration standpoint, multi-prime is really, really hard to do unless you've got a dedicated staff of people who are construction folks who manage the construction of the building. It can be cost effective, but oftentimes it more often than not cost you more money because there's delay that's not the fault of one of the major contractors, and there is an extenuation of the time to complete the project. So multi-prime, I would say I don't particularly favor multi-prime just because I don't think it gets you the best outcome. But that's experience talking. That shouldn't any more than just knowing that it exists. Dual bidding is this wonderful hybrid. And that's where the board solicits bids via an RFP for both a single prime and a multi-prime. So whenever you advertise, you say that you could award the contract to a single general contractor, or you may decide to contract with 4 contractors and get all the options on the table and then figure out whether or not you want to do a single prime for construction of the building, or if you want to do multi-prime. So I like to call dual bidding as you can't make up your mind, so you get as much information as possible and you pick one, or 4. So, any questions about those 3 before I move on to the next one?
I just want to ask, when you say that you have to pick the lowest responsive bidder.
Yes, ma'am.
What if the lowest bidder does not have a good track record of finishing on time or other things? Are you bound by that lowest bidder, or can you take a higher bid?
You can take a higher bid, and it goes to the responsiveness and the responsibility of the bidder. So oftentimes, one of the things I would put in an RFP, and do put in an RFP, is how many of your last projects ended on time, under budget, and using that as a measure of how responsible that bidder is. How many times have they come in over budget? How many change orders, if you will, and we can talk about change orders a lot, but how many change orders do they ask for? Because how many times are they coming back asking for more money?
I ask that because when you put that there, it gives the impression that we are stuck with the lowest responsible bidder. But if that is not the case, then that's a misleader to this board and other boards that you do this slide presentation with and for.
Well, so the responsibility portion is the item that you have to pay attention to, because that is the legal standard. I mean, that's quoting the statute. So it's just making sure you capture all three elements. It has to be the lowest, and it has to be the most responsive, and then it has to be responsible.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
The multiple contracts.
Yes, sir.
The concern that it appears that I would have.
Mhm.
For example, and not that this would be the case, but just as in preparing the parking lot, you have two contractors. One prepares it, one paves it. And within a few months, you've got potholes, you've got sunken spots. The paper says, I paved it correctly. But the person that prepared it's wrong. And the person that prepared it said, I prepared it correctly, and the paving is wrong. And we're left holding the bag.
That's exactly right. That's why multi-prime bidding is not particularly fun. What's even harder than that, Mr. Mercer, is whenever you get into installing steel beams inside of a facility based on the specifications of an architect, and having an electrician and a general contractor who disagree. Well, guess what? Both of those are prime contractors, but they've got separate contracts with you. And they're at each other's throats trying to figure out who's responsible and who's going to be bearing the cost of the mistake of ordering the wrong thing.
And a lot of times it leads to a problem that's difficult to get corrected.
Yes, sir. And oftentimes it can be expensive as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. So these methods are done by doing an RFP. The next methods, the alternative methods, if you will, are requests for qualifications. Now, request for qualifications, as the board will remember, is the similar process to selecting an architect, where you don't have the lowest responsible bidder standard. You have to pick whom you like the most based on their experience, their qualifications, and you aren't paying much attention at all to how much it's going to cost them to build the facility at this point. So the first option is construction manager at risk, or CMAR. I will tell you at the outset that CMAR is in vogue right now. Lots of county governments use it. I've got several school districts that use it because their counties like using it, and I've had great experiences and I've had bad experiences. I think it is contractor specific, and I think it's architect specific. I think you want people who work well together. In any event, that doesn't matter whether it's a single prime or whether it's a CMAR. But this is a very popular method, and here's why. The board selects using an RFQ to pick the general contractor to do the work, and the CMAR guarantees the board that it will construct the building to the architect's specifications for a guaranteed maximum price, or what's known as a GMP. In this set of facts, I imagine this board's GMP is going to be something less than $20 million. because you need to take into account your architect's fees. So it's going to be less than $20 million, more likely than not. So, however, I will tell you that the GMP is normally not set until all subcontractor bids have been opened and in hand. So even if the construction manager at risk gives you a number during the preliminary method until bid opening, if the numbers come in over budget, the board has two options. Option one at that time is generally you send the construction manager out risk back out to bid with drawings that have attempted to reduce the cost, also known as value engineering the project. You take the drawings and you try to reduce the cost as much as possible, and you put them back out to get different bids. Construction, just like anything, is a seasonal field. You know, people who are putting in these bids are doing their very best to capture what the market's going to look like by the time their trade gets into the building. And when you're talking about building something over a 2-year period, which is what you're doing, contractors are conservative people. They are trying their best to give you a fair number, but at the same time, they're not, most of them, mind you, are not going to lose their shirts in putting a number down because they know they're going to be bound to that number. So with a construction manager at risk, whenever they get to the point of where the rubber meets the road and they have to give you a guaranteed maximum price, if that guaranteed maximum price is over the number that you want to spend, you can, the construction manager at risk has the opportunity to walk away. If you say, no, I want you to give me the building I want for the number you want, they can walk away and you have to start over. Generally speaking, that's not what happens. Like I said, normally what happens is their drawings get redone. They try to bring the project in budget, but it's one of the issues that come along with construction manager at risk. Like I say, it's very favored by county governments because they believe that it guarantees that the project will not go over budget. However, I will say that, like I said, I've had great experience with construction manager at risk on new construction jobs, and they do great work, and they actually bring it in well under the budget, which is a great savings to you. Because if they save money under the guaranteed maximum price, they don't get to keep it. It comes back to you. So it's, I mean, there are some huge positives. But it's called construction manager at risk because the risk for them is once they give you a guaranteed maximum price and you are in the construction process, they can't come back and ask you for more money. They have to be able to get the job done. The next method is design build. This is something I think is inappropriate for this project given where we are. But that's where a board would issue an RFQ for an architect and a contractor together to work as a team to submit qualifications for a project together. The method requires a single contract between all three parties. Right now, that's an impractical situation because you've already selected your architect, and design build typically has you doing an RFQ for them together and the contractor and the architect applying together, saying, we're the team who want to build this school for you. And then you pick the team you like. The last is public-private partnerships. I would also think this is impractical because 50% of the financing of the cost of the project has to be provided by the private partner. And in this case, you guys don't need that because you've got grant money to build the Watt building. So, in any event, those are your building methods. I will happily take questions right now. Dr. Mills, if you want to share anything at this time, I'll turn it over to you, but that's what I wanted to share with the board before you go about picking a building method. Let's talk about what they are.
Members of the board, we do need to pick a method.
This may be something you want to discuss with your attorney in closed session as well, correct, Mr. McPherson?
Yes, if the board wishes to seek my advice in closed session, I welcome the opportunity as well.
Would you like to seek counsel advice in closed session?
I would.
Mrs. Barnes said yes. Mr. Mercer said yes. Ms. Boyette, would you like to discuss this in closed session with advice from counsel?
That's fine.
Mrs. Powell?
Yes.
Mr. Farmer?
Please.
Mr. Breen?
Yes.
And Fitch, yes, we will include this in with our closed session discussion.
So, Madam Chair, I would advise that we table this item until after closed session.
All right. Does this require a motion for me to table?
Yes, ma'am.
Members of the board, would you like to, the chair will entertain a motion to table this item until we return from closed session.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Mercer?
I move that we table this item until we return from closed session.
Second.
It has been moved and properly seconded that we table this item until we return from closed session to allow us to confer with board attorney. Mrs. Boyette?
Aye.
Mrs. Barnes?
Aye.
Mrs. Powell?
Aye.
Mr. Farmer? Mr. Breen? Mr. Mercer? And Fitch? Aye. The motion carries unanimously. We are now at the portion of our agenda that calls for closed session. Mr. Farmer?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I move that we, Wilson County Board of Education, go into closed session to consider confidential personnel matters as provided in North Carolina General Statutes 143-318.11A1 and 6 and 115C-319 through 321 to consider confidential student matters as provided in North Carolina General Statutes 143-318.11A1 and North Carolina General Statutes 115C-402 and the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act 20 U.S. Code 1232G, and to consult with the Board of Education attorney and preserve the attorney-client privileges provided in North Carolina General Statutes 143-318.11A3.
I second.
It has been moved by Mr. Farmer, seconded by Mrs. Barnes, that the Wilson County Board of Education go into closed session to consider confidential personnel matters as provided in North Carolina General Statutes 143-318.11A1 and 6 and 115C-319 through 321. To consider confidential student matters as provided in the North Carolina General Statutes 143-318.11A1 and North Carolina General Statutes 115C-402 and the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act 20 United States Code 1232G, and to consult with the Board of Education attorney and provide the attorney-client privilege as provided in North Carolina General Statutes 143-318.11A3. Is there any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor of the motion, let it be known by the sign of aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Let the record reflect that the motion carries unanimously. We are adjourned to closed session.
Roll call.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so used to just, we need a roll call vote on that motion to go into closed session. Mrs. Boyette?
Aye.
Mrs. Barnes?
Aye.
Mrs. Powell?
Aye.
Mr. Farmer? Mr. Breen? Mr. Mercer? Fitch? Aye. Let the record reflect that the motion carries unanimously. We are now adjourned to closed session.